Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to FIDIC webinar on United Nations Anti-Corruption Day. Today, Wednesday, 9th of December, is the UN International Anti-Corruption Day, and FIDIC is proud to participate in this program by putting up this webinar. I am delighted once again to invite to have a lot of people around the world who are supporting us on this initiative. Some of you have been an active participant on FIDIC webinar, but just for the avoidance of doubt, for those who are new to this particular issue, I will take you through the program for the day. We intend to spend 1.5 hours altogether. In this early phase, I will do a very brief introduction to the theme and invite our president to say a few words. Thereafter, there will be a keynote speech, roughly for about 7 minutes, even though 10 minutes is shown. And then immediately after that, then I'll have a panel discussion whereby we'll invite, 3 members who will say a few words on the same subject, and they're coming from different particular parts of the world, from investment banking, from private company who are very big multinational with big footprint, and also, we bring somebody who have some idea on how we can improve, corruption in our industry. Thereafter, there will be Q&A session. That Q&A session, I'll kickstart it with few questions from my side. Then I will allow time for questions to come from the floor. And we'll also put this question to the panelists. And then I will invite Bill, our president, to say a few words in closing round before we summarize. So without further ado, I'm going to actually basically set the scene by asking Bill to come on board. But before we do that, just let's look at the figures that we get from OECD. My understanding is that you look at the 5 least corrupt nations in the world, it gives you that you got Denmark all the way to Sweden, and then you rate in the 5 most corrupted nations in the world. These are not my figure, it goes on with Somalia and North Korea. And then on top of that, you ask the question, who are the participants in this corruption? It's very, 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 very Billy, that actually we get to know that the police are actually involved with this, elected representatives are involved with it, government officials are involved with this. We have business executive and local government. When you look at politicians as well, evidence shows that some prime minister and president are equally involved. The map is there in red, in different color, on how bad different nation is. Now, we are not here to point fingers at any particular country, but we at FIDIC, we have 3 golden messages that we talked about. The quality of design in construction industry, the issue about sustainability in construction industry, and on top of that, the integrity in the way we deliver projects. And that's why the sustainability development goal is quite important to us, because we do believe that if we can mitigate or eradicate corruption in construction and infrastructure industry, then we have a good chance of the value proposition coming across to those who are really deserve to be the winner of it. Without further ado, I am going to hand over to Bill, our president, to say a few words and just open us up. Bill, the floor is yours. Bill?
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Nelson. I had a little bit of trouble unmuting, so I apologize for that. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Nelson, and the Secretariat for putting on this webinar on a subject so important to us all. Over the past year, we have produced a lot of webinars, and one of the benefits, nice things we've seen from it, is the number of people from all around the world who have been participating in our webinars, and in many ways, ironically, as we're all sort of locked up in our homes and that kind of thing, I think FIDIC has reached out to more people around the world in the past year than we ever have, and that's a very, very good thing. So thanks to you, Nelson, and thanks to the Secretariat for putting on this this very timely and very important webinar. As Nelson mentioned, FIDIC is built on 3 basic items, and that is quality, integrity, and sustainability. And of course, corruption is directly connected to integrity. As many of us know, the cost of corruption is estimated to be a staggering $3.5 to $4, or maybe even more, $1 trillion a year. It's an incredible number. To put that in perspective, just from the water infrastructure needs alone, that is almost twice what is needed to meet all of the global water infrastructure needs by 2030 on an annual basis. And that's an incredible number if it's anywhere close to being correct, which most of us think it is. So it exceeds dramatically what we need to improve just water infrastructure and certainly to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 6. I cannot emphasize enough how much FIDIC condemns corruption. We absolutely condemn corruption. And as I mentioned, there's a huge dollar amount in it. But it just doesn't stop with dollars. Corruption adds to lack of trust in government and infrastructure. And we see examples of failed infrastructure and failed projects all around the world. So there's a dollar value associated with it, but more importantly, in my view, there's a trust value. As an engineer, when I think about corruption, I always think about the fact that engineers as individuals and as a profession are generally well respected, considered to be extraordinarily honest. But when the same engineers get involved with construction and infrastructure projects, there is justifiable heavy criticism for inefficiency, and much of that inefficiency is caused by corruption. So it's a slightly ironic that as a profession we're very trusted, but we're involved to a large degree in infrastructure, which frankly does not have the greatest of reputations. Tying all of this into the pandemic, what we have heard over the summer about working relationships among engineers during the pandemic, we have become, in my view, we've become very efficient, more cost effective. We've seen many, many examples of our executing projects rapidly because they had to be implemented rapidly and of high quality. I ask myself from that experience if we can somehow connect that to the mission and the goals that many of us have of reducing the life cycle cost of infrastructure. For example, the American Society of Civil Engineers has a goal to reduce the life cycle cost of infrastructure by 50%. In my view, engineers, if allowed to be innovative and in a world without corruption, can really achieve that. We know we can through innovation and trust. And I hope that with all the pain we've suffered this year, it'll move us more into that very important direction. The final thing I'd say about corruption, as many of us know, there are many, and Nelson put up a chart indicating where it comes from. What I hear over and over again is that corruption generally comes from three sources: the actual clients, the owners of the projects, the consulting engineers on the project, and the contractors. Now, there's a lot more, of course, but there are three entities that have a role in controlling it, and we need to look at all of them. So we need to focus on all of these, and we need to do it with confidence that when challenged, we can meet the big goal of reducing corruption around the world. So thank you once again, and thank you for the panelists for participating in this session. With that, Nelson, back to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks for setting us very well in the setting. I'm just hoping that you can all hear me and there's no difficulties with the system. Corruption thrives in times of crisis, and the ongoing global pandemic has not been an exception. During the COVID-19 health crisis, fighting corruption can mean different between the life and death, an advocate of hunger, having a roof over your head, or becoming homeless. During the ongoing pandemic, all nations have taken significant measures to address the health and emergency and to avoid a global economic collapse. they have mobilized billions in funds to procure medical equipment and provide economic safety for citizens and business industry. However, the urgent response required during the pandemic can create significant opportunity for corruption. So this year, International Corruption Day theme highlight that an inclusive COVID-19 recovery can only achieve with integrity and accountability. With that particular, setting, I mean, it's easy for us to very much go across and start, talking about corruption. I always, start off by saying when people say which sector is more corrupt, and say the construction sector is very corrupt. Well, we have a fragmented sector, and therefore there's opportunity for this thing to happen. But the reality of it, there are other sectors which are far, far worse. Today, we are not pointing finger. It's really about how our industry is working together to find a way forward. So without further ado, I am going to use this opportunity before I actually start with the first panelist to put a question to the audience, which is a very simple question. Is our industry doing enough to combat corruption in the infrastructure sector? This is a very simple opportunity. So you do have an opportunity for you to record your vote. So please have a look through the poll on your footprint. You will see a sign to say poll, and then you should go there and actually try and decide, which particular one that you should do, and press submit. And that way the result will come through. And before we dive into the conversation, Barbara, my big lady behind the scene, who is the engine behind our thinking, she will show us the outcome of that. So we have roughly about 20 seconds for everybody to vote on the question. Are we doing enough as an industry in fighting and combating corruption? I think we've got roughly about 10 seconds for the answer to come true. And very shortly, Barbara will give us the outcome of that. I do feel we should have this as a starting point before we dive into the conversation. And there will be another one later on just to try and see whether people believe. So the question, are we doing enough? And the answer is no. There's always room for improvement. So with that starting point, perhaps that gives us a close starting that, exactly what was said by Bill, that, yes, we want to fight corruption, but the general public of those who are listening do not feel we are doing enough. So on that note, James, as the board member responsible for Integrity Management Committee, and who are very also active in Africa, James, the floor is yours to give us a kickstart, for about 5 minutes, set the story, and then we can start the conversation. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nelson. Let me start by recognizing my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to have you on board on a very important day, discussing a very, very important topic. Let me also recognize the FIDIC Secretariat for putting this together. And then lastly, the almost 200 participants that we have so far listening in, and hopefully engaging us even more in the next couple of minutes as we dive into this particular topic of corruption. Let me start by saying that the poll question that has just come in, very, very pertinent and interestingly enough, a very telling answer that indeed we're not doing enough. We recognize that even amongst ourselves, we're not doing enough. It therefore means that this conversation has to be made stronger, has to be made more frequent until we internalize the fight against corruption. Let me start by saying also that the impact of COVID-19 has not spared the infrastructure sector. And indeed, many projects have slowed down. Many have come to a standstill. Obviously, our sector was not ready for this level of a pandemic. But the good thing is that the world worked tirelessly to understand the disease, and in so doing put up preventive measures, many of which affected construction works, etc., from a health standpoint. The goodness is that we are on the road to recovery, and the recent announcement of vaccines makes that road a bit more clear, but we're still very far from the woods. The impact of this pandemic has had negative impact on the funding of projects. We have limited funds. We have other national competing interests in countries, key amongst them, obviously, the need to put in health measures to drive up enhancement of infrastructure, health-related infrastructure. And this is all geared towards slowing down the disease and obviously enhancing the rate of cure. So with the new normal setting in, it's recognized that infrastructure projects are slowly getting back underway, but the rate, of course, is much reduced. And like we said, the priority of these projects is actually changing. So it means that we've got to have a new approach. We've got to ensure that the funds that are available for infrastructure development have a much bigger impact, meaning that we have got to cut down waste. Remembering that even before COVID, the infrastructure sector still faced challenges to do with corruption, cost overruns, delays, poor design, poor quality, some of which were mentioned. So certainly this waste cannot continue. It's not going to be business as normal. And as mentioned by the FIDIC president, the way we execute this project, we have found out that there's still room for improvement on execution processes. And whilst doing that, maintaining the health of the people in this particular industry. Let me just say that for the FIDIC family, this is our time to enhance the use of the tools that have been put in place. For those who may not be aware, FIDIC has developed integrity management tools to fight and eradicate unethical practices. And these guidelines are basically geared towards the consulting industries. And I'll just enumerate the three powerful tools that FIDIC has put in place. We have, we entitle them FIMS, meaning FIDIC Integrity Management System. We have part 1 that covers the policies and principles. We have part 2, taking it further and putting in procedures. And then we have part 3, which looks at standard for compliance, etc. So meaning that with these 3 tools, you have the consulting world is well equipped or can be well equipped to put in place measures that will fight corruption. So let me also mention that these tools, of course, focus on the supply side of corruption. So the game is to also remember that as we do this, there are other players who have also got to tackle corruption from their side. One of the key things that we are focusing on and will continue to focus on is to ensure that the penetration of the use of these tools within engineering firms is enhanced, because the tools can only be as useful as the level of use and embrace that we'll have within the consulting firms themselves. Indeed, anti-corruption should become a lifestyle. The other thing, of course, is the fact that procurement, where normally corruption starts, those processes also need to be tightened, even as we look at the fact that some of these processes will now need to take into account the new normal, or geared towards ensuring that the projects that are carried out in a manner that is effective as possible. Let me also just say that FIDIC has been very, very active, as many of you may know, in engaging other players, key amongst them the multilateral development banks, government agencies, obviously very important when it comes to government agencies, because we are talking about potentially the demand side of corruption. And then, of course, other very important key stakeholders, Transparency International, whose statistics have just been shared, showing how corruption can be minimized or has been minimized in certain parts of the world, and in other places it is still quite high. Other important players, including ISO, what we call COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, World Federation of Engineering Organizations, and other bodies all geared towards corruption. And I think the key strategy will continue to develop and roll out standards and guidelines to improve the project life cycle. It is also worth noting that since I mentioned procurement, FIDIC has developed a procurement procedure guide that is available to the different stakeholders involved in this process. The other thing that we can say is that given that we need to minimize and eradicate corruption, obviously it means that we may need to increase awareness of this vice amongst all stakeholders. And we need to do that so that stakeholders can embed integrity management systems within their workplace or make them part of their strategic objectives. So for us in the consulting world, with the tools that we have, likewise, the other stakeholders also need to develop and embed those type of tools in the fight against corruption. It is also important to align anti-corruption initiatives. as well as embrace monitoring, evaluation, etc. Because it is one thing having the systems in place, we also need to see how effective they are. And then coming towards the end, we must recognize that amongst, strangely enough, the positive impacts of the pandemic is the embracing of technology in the execution of work processes. And one of the tools that, of course, has come to be embraced and very strongly is what we're using right now, which is the use of webinars and virtual meetings. What does that do? It means that the reach can go further. We can enhance awareness, enhance transparency, and also promote sharing of best practices, as well as sharing data on critical aspects of anti-corruption measures, including what has been mentioned, name and shame, etc. We can also share trends and experiences. So I would say, thank God that technology was able to respond very, very quickly to this pandemic. And we need to continue to use these particular kinds of technology tools in the fight against corruption. So in conclusion, as we mark the World Anti-Corruption Day, we see light at the end of the tunnel in the anti-corruption fight and promotion of ethical behavior. And I can say lastly that FIDIC will continue to have anti-corruption as a high agenda. So with those few words, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you very much, James, for that insight into FIDIC world. And at this point in time, I want to mention our panelist who is going to sort of join us in our conversation. And they've been carefully chosen, really, so that we do have what I call a true global footprint. On one hand, I've got Juliana Fox from WSP, I've got Hamid from Aiib, and I've got Peter Matthews from COSTI, which is Engineering Against Poverty, but actually with a special initiative. The task really for the three panelists who's going to speak is to look at it from their own point of view. Juliana will start first, and obviously with WSP, a ever-growing company with recent acquisition of a major company in Canada, got footprint all over the world, different geography, different jurisdiction, huge number of stakeholders they have to, both private sector and public sector. And I thought it'd be appropriate, and I have to declare interest. I used to work for WSP a long time ago, and I'm still very much interested in what's going on there. It'll be interesting to have from Juliana what they're doing as an organization to make sure they are fit in this particular area. And as James said, and also Bill said, it's not really just about what we are doing as sector, it's what about the other stakeholders? How are they engaging to make sure both from the client, the supply chain, and all the people working for them? So Juliana, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for those who don't know me, I'm the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of WSP, so I really oversee the business ethics program across the organization. And I think right now it's very timely to talk about integrity and recovering with integrity. We're facing uncertain times, and uncertain times means we have to increase our discussions on those topics. And coming from the corporate world, carrying out business with integrity is already part of our everyday dialogue and will continue to be part of everyday dialogue in the future. And what this means from a recovery perspective is that business ethics and doing business with integrity really has to be part of the strategic recovery process. That has to be one of the components that leaders and business leaders talk about when they're talking about their recovery strategy. And therefore, we have to look at how our governance in corporations will be evolving with the post-pandemic realities. So assuming that you're from a company and you already have governance processes in place, what that evolution looks like really, to me, has 3 points in time. So, I think the industry has done a good job. We see business ethics programs across the board in a lot of companies, and so a lot of organizations had a pre-pandemic reality, right? We had a baseline in terms of policies, controls, systems in place to address the risk of corruption. And that baseline is not going away. That's a pre-pandemic reality that is going to carry over into the recovery process. But along the way, you know, pre-pandemic evolved, right? We have the pandemic period that we're still in. And to me, that pandemic period, we had to adapt our baseline policies and controls and processes. So the pandemic period was really a process of adapting internal governance processes within organizations. And over the past year, we all had to adapt. We all had to demonstrate immense agility to face the different realities that were changing before our eyes. Which, you know, that adaptation was done in order to address shifting risk profiles. When we talk about corruption, you can't dissociate corruption from risk, right? So we adapted to change to different risk profiles, shifting fraud risks, corruption risks that were caused notably by working from home, which was an increased isolation for employees, as well as pressure to maintain revenues. And these shifting risks really meant that we had to adapt our mitigation strategies in order to address the risk. And adapting mitigation strategies, and like a lot of organizations did, meant implementing strong work from home policies, making sure managers and leaders combated employee isolation by increasing communication. You know, in-person training had to be transformed into online training. So when you're looking at the internal controls within organizations to combat corruption, you really saw a big shift and adaptation during the pandemic. So again, we started with these baseline programs with policies, controls, procedures. We had to adapt. And now what is it going to look like during the recovery? Well, you know, we have things in place, but they're all going to have to be reinforced. But not only are they going to have to be reinforced, but we're also going to have to demonstrate immense flexibility. Recovery is not going to look the same way across the globe. It's going to be different from one country to another. Recovery is going to be timed differently also from one country to another. So it's really important to reinforce the controls that are implemented within organizations and to be flexible to adapt to regional realities, regional corruption risk, regional status of the recovery, to really meet the needs within each region. You know, it's really, again, I can't emphasize it enough. It's going to be important to reinforce that baseline and adapted governance and ethics program to account for the changed landscape of risk that will be caused by the pandemic. And when you look at what that changed landscape and risk will look like, well, you know, I really have two contributing risk factors that come immediately to mind, one on the supply side and one on the demand side. When you talk about the risk factors that come on the supply side, well, organizations are going to feel pressure to financially recover by maintaining or increasing their revenue stream. So you see that risk on the supply side coupled with this risk on the demand side, where national governments are going to be eager to invest in infrastructure to jumpstart their recovery. And in certain cases, governments may consider implementing measures to reduce time needed to kickstart infrastructure projects. So those two risks coupled together may give an opportunity for corruption to flourish. And you know, the bottom line in all this is that corruption was a problem before the pandemic, but the crisis has really heightened the importance of strong governance and ethics program and heightened the importance to reinforce the controls that are already in place and to make sure that they're properly communicated throughout the organization so that that business ethics tone, that business ethics strategy is really an ingrained part of the organization's recovery process.
Well, thank you very much, Juliana, for that, massive high-level corporate perspective. What I hear from that is there's always been a challenge of this issue of our business ethic. We have things there before the pandemic. Pandemic is heightening it, both from the supply side and from the demand side. And we need to be careful that we'll revisit the baseline to make sure that we align it with the changing and at what point people are coming out of the pandemic and how you move that through different businesses. That's been really helpful. We'll come back to that later on, Juliana. I'm going to invite Hamid Sharif now, who is Managing Director of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I think his remit is very much like, Juliana, overseeing this particular area. I was in Beijing, I think early this year, for my scene. In fact, I think I was there up until 17th of January, 23rd of January, we had the breakout or complete lockdown in Wuhan. And at that time, I was saying to Hamid, well, he said, FIDIC used to do quite a lot in this area. Why aren't you? I said, don't worry, when the time comes, I shall call you. So Hamid, you are now online. Thank you for joining us. And let's have your perspective from the standpoint that you have Aiib, new kid on the block, with huge investment. We've just had Juliana from the point of view of saying people on the demand side, is very much trying to see how quickly can you get the product to the market and infrastructure lending. What are you doing as the investor or co-financer of projects? So Hamid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nelson and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be interacting with FIDIC. I've, in the past, been very familiar with FIDIC as a former head of procurement for ADB. So it's good to interact with FIDIC with a very different hat, of that of integrity. Let me just say, by way of a few words to the introduction to Aiib, that this is a young bank. We've been in operations almost 5 years, and in this short period, we've got about 22 billion lending achieved already, about 106 projects. Half of them, just over half, are co-financed with other multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank Group, ADB, EBRD, and so on. So one of the very first policies passed by this bank was the policy on prohibited practices. And this is really significant, that this was a policy deliberately adopted. Unlike other, the legacy multilateral development banks, it didn't take a crisis. It didn't need a crisis for us to buy into this. This is part of our DNA. And in fact, President Jin has coined the key values of the bank in this phrase, that the bank is a lean, clean, green bank. And it's the clean value which my office is most concerned with. And so our policy is fully aligned with the other MDBs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So we have fraud, corruption, collusion, and coercion, and obstruction as the five main prohibited practices. In addition, we have a misuse of resources and theft. And we unilaterally adopted the sanction list of other five MDBs which have signed the AMED, the Agreement on Mutual Enforcement of Debarment Decisions. So as a result, we refuse to deal with over 1,000 companies and individuals which are on that list. And this year, we've also had the first sanctions by this bank, where we completed our investigation, and we've sanctioned 6 Chinese firms and 1 individual, and that's gone onto our sanctions list, and then the list is there on our website. Now, a young bank focusing on infrastructure, and along comes COVID, and the demand, obviously, from our clients, member countries, is for fast disbursing loans to meet the pandemic. And I think this is, in that sense, I think MDBs, AIB, and governments have been put in a similar situation. You have a fire going on. You have to put that fire out. You need to get the water to put the fire out. You don't have time to think about, integrity risks and so on. And I think this has been a very difficult balancing act for governments and for MDBs, that how do you balance the immediate need for funds with the need to do adequate due diligence to ensure that there isn't corruption. And I think, as James pointed out, in the process, the priorities of governments have also changed. Because the priority is dealing with the pandemic. It's not building new infrastructure or even ongoing infrastructure as such. So we've seen that shift very much, and as we talk to our colleagues in other multilateral development banks, that's the story panning out. So the projected disbursements for 2020, which we had for our ordinary operations, our normal operations, those are going to be considerably lower because they've been overtaken by this emergency fast disbursement. Now, fast disbursement, I think it had to be there. You had to get the money out. You had to buy the equipment at super fast speed. You had to help government. But then what can you do? And I think as we're reflecting over this, obviously, we need to do what you might call post-event assurance. So you go back and look at the major transactions. You look at the records. You look at the processes. You look at the companies who are awarded this. Now, we know, I use UK as an example. You've got terrible headlines where companies associated with ruling party politicians have been awarded major contracts. You've got companies which never dealt with health care or healthcare equipment getting dollars of hundreds of getting contracts of hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds. And those are in developed jurisdiction. Now you take that scenario to a developing country where the institutional checks and balances are much weaker. And surely enough, I think the risk of corruption has definitely increased. That said, at least I think the presence of MDBs, I think still compared to the national systems, gives at least some assurance that there will be accountability and that there is adequate oversight. And that is something, as we now post disbursement, we're beginning to look at audits, we're beginning to look at the paper trail. I think some of these things will be spotted, and it's to be expected. I think one doesn't have to be an alarmist because it is the nature of an emergency that you've had to spend money very, very quickly. But in the post event phase, I think we now have to sort of go back and identify corruption where it has taken place and work with the national authorities. Now I come back to the COVID. So one is COVID assistance program. Then of course our ordinary operations. What do you do about ongoing projects? You can no longer visit them because even if you have, and AIB so far doesn't have any country offices, but even if we did, within the country, there are restrictions on travel. You don't want to expose your own staff to the risk of the pandemic. So field visits have been very difficult. So we've been brainstorming to see, well, how can we use remote technology? How can we remotely monitor projects? What sort of paper trail can we have? And going forward, during the pandemic, as you enter into contracts, how can you shift the fiduciary burden more to the contractors and penalize them should you discover corruption? So I think we're all on a learning curve on this. And lastly, let me say that we all talk about compliance programs, and as some sort of a panacea. They're not. And I'm going to finish on a pretty depressing note that you look at Goldman Sachs case, and in October they settled with the SEC for a record, $3 billion plus. And if you read that deferred prosecution agreement, it's pretty depressing. Here you have state-of-the-art investment bank with a terrific compliance program, but the culture was one of increasing revenues, and many people just looked away. And this is the real issue for consulting firms too. I mean, there's the incentive to increase revenues. How many times is that going to trump the ethical values which a good organization should have? And I think that's the central question. Now, I know that, for many, many years now, FIDIC has had its FIMS and, it's been trying to market it and so on. But frankly, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the ethics of the leadership of each consulting firm. And it's going to take those consulting firms working with anti-corruption departments, of IFIs, MDBs in particular, and where they can approach where there are credible anti-corruption agencies in countries, they will need to work with them, and in the process, it's going to be painful. I mean, I don't for a minute pretend that there isn't going to be loss of revenue, but I think that balance has to be struck, and I think appropriate alliances and coalitions have to be made to make this possible. I'll stop here, Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. That's a very good insight. We're looking at you from the new kid on the block. 22 billion is not a small money. Riding on the back of the existing MDB, I hear that loud and clear. And you said, of course, you are learning and you are actually doing the debarment. So you join all the MDB in following the same pattern, which is very encouraging. But actually, the point you raised towards the end that, leaders have to take a position on this subject is quite interesting. What I'm also interested to know is that can we learn from other industry? And I know that in the oil and gas sector, people talk about construction industry as an area of real corruption. But I know defense sector is terrible. Nobody talks about it because it's all intergovernment relationship. And it doesn't have to go too far to look at what happened on a big Saudi Arabia, conversation and military, defense issue. And that was an intergovernment issue. What I want to bring into the conversation now is really look at the example of how we can overcome this. Now, I know that there's a lot of questions coming through from the floor. We are monitoring there, so please be patient with us. We're going to come back to the question and answer. I want to invite Peter Matthews now, who is Executive Director of Custody and Infrastructure Transparency Agenda. And he will probably share with us what is it all about, where did it come from in terms of history, because I know this has got something to do with oil and gas, then move into construction, and how it's been applied, because effectively it's not just on the supply side, but also looking at from demand side. And the issue about using technology and transparency and data, being absolutely transparent is critical. So Peter, you're going to be the last one before we open the question. So Peter, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson, for those words of introduction. And thank you to FIDIC for organizing this important event and for all the attendees from around the world, well over 200 I see now. COST has a very strong relationship with FIDIC that has been established over a number of years. As Nelson indicated in his opening remarks, FIDIC nominated one of its board members to join the board of COST, Gavin English, who I'm sure many of you will know. So they're really very strong relationship between the two organizations, and we really value our association with FIDIC. So thank you for including us in this event today. I'll give a quick overview of COST, pick up on some of the points that Nelson pointed to. And then I just want to briefly identify three issues, three things that I want to suggest will help in our efforts to ensure that there is recovery with integrity. So COST works with government, industry, and civil society to promote the disclosure of information on public and increasingly public-private investment in infrastructure. The idea is that if you can publish good quality data and support the analysis of that data, that can help to inform and empower stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean individual citizens, NGOs, business associations, the media, parliamentarians. This data, the analysis that accompanies it, can inform and empower those stakeholders and enable them to exercise accountability, to increase public scrutiny and to hold decision makers to account. And experience shows that where you increase scrutiny of decision makers, it reduces the space for corruption and other types of inefficiency to occur. That can contribute to better decision making, better value for money, and ultimately better quality infrastructure and services. And we all have, anyone who pays their taxes has an investment in getting better value for money. Anybody who relies on public services to go about their business and to run their family life, we all benefit from less corruption and more transparency. We have a growing track record of impact. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Ministry of Finance in Thailand announced that the Cost Thailand program has helped to save $460 million from public investment. And Thailand is still in the relatively early stages of reform, so we expect those figures to increase. There are a number of examples of very significant institutional reforms. In Honduras, for example, the president used the information published by Cost to close a road fund. It was considered that it was too corrupt, it was beyond reform. Cost doesn't close institutions. We don't prosecute anyone. Our role is to publish objective information that's dispassionate, and it's those with the power and the authority that can use that information to improve things. We have also trained a network of public officials, civil society activists, private sector, those working in the private sector, of how to understand, to use the information that's disclosed through Cost to exercise accountability. Currently working in 19 countries around the world. Currently mostly low income and middle income countries. And one of our priorities is to get more high income countries involved. I think sometimes there is a perception that high income countries don't have to show the same level of concern about transparency and anti-corruption. This will be a very informed audience in a FIDIC event, and you will know that that's simply not true. And I think that the problems that we've had around the pandemic and emergency procurement help to emphasize that. That's a quick overview of Cost, and I'd be happy to return to some of those themes when we come to the questions and answers. I just wanted to very briefly outline 3 things that I want to suggest will help in terms of promoting recovery with integrity. The first one is to get serious about the governance of infrastructure. And Juliana spoke about this and reinforced the need from a private sector perspective, and it's extremely important in the private sector, but also, of course, in the public sector, in the clients, in the demand side that Nelson referred to. So when I talk about governance, I mean the policies, systems, and procedures that we use to deliver infrastructure. Good governance is when these are working well, and when the contributions of all those involved are coordinated, when efficiencies are minimized, and there is a high degree of public trust. As I mentioned, the coronavirus pandemic has, I think, exposed the weaknesses of governance. Billions of dollars of public contracts awarded with no transparency, which Hamid referred to, shortages of vital equipment, poor messaging, and not surprisingly, a lack of public trust. That's not true in all countries, and some have pointed out that in historical terms, the pandemic might be seen as being very pivotal in the shift of global power from west to east. And if that is true, and the extent to which it's true, it will be a result of many factors. But I would suggest that governance is an important one. For decades, the West has been rolling back the state, privatizing, outsourcing, and this hasn't been the case in the East, certainly not to the same extent. And obviously this is broad brushstrokes. There are countries in the West who have done better and countries in the East that have done less well. But broadly, I think that there's something in that argument. This is not a call for a return to big government. This is an argument for effective government, and that requires investment. So I think it's interesting, this potential for this global shift. Hamid is based in Beijing, and I'm certain if he thinks I've got that wrong, he will correct me when it comes to the Q&A. The second point I wanted to say is that we need to recognize transparency as a fundamental value. The importance of transparency is recognized across the institutional spectrum. Governments, development banks, NGOs, companies routinely express their commitment to transparency. Of course, commitment is not the same as the ability to put it into practice, but that's often how progress is made. First, you need to recognize the importance of something, and then it's a process of adopting practical steps to actually realize it. However, transparency is usually seen in instrumental terms. It's a means to an end, be that building trust, increasing scrutiny, or improving efficiency. All really important things, and all things that transparency can certainly contribute to. But the risk is, whilst we think of transparency in instrumental terms, it appears optional. It might be useful today, but not necessarily once the goals have been achieved or when other instruments become available. So I want to suggest that transparency should be understood as a core value. It goes to the heart of the social contract between governments and citizens. Think of it like integrity. It's not something to be adopted and abandoned when considered no longer useful. Those who govern us need our consent, and part of the price for that exchange, is that governments need to be open and transparent in all that they do. Now, it's important to point out that transparency as a core value does not mean that there are no limits to it. There is a public interest test that can be applied to establish those limits. I mentioned Thailand and financial cost savings announced by the Ministry of Finance. I remember in the early stages of that program having a conversation with the Airports Authority of Thailand when we were introducing cost to the extension to Suvarnabhumi Airport in Bangkok. And one of the officials said to me, "Do you expect us to publish the drawings and specifications of the airport extension?" And the answer is no. An airport is a very vulnerable asset, and it would not be in the public interest to publish information that could be used by those who might want to attack it. There are a similar set of arguments around commercial confidentiality. So transparency has its limits, and there's a public interest test that can help us to set those limits. So those are the three things, just in summary: to get serious about governance, to recognize transparency as a fundamental value. The last one is to incorporate, I've only done two. The last one was to incorporate anti-corruption into the infratech agenda. And infratech refers to new and innovative technologies and the way that they support the development, delivery, and the operation of infrastructure. At Cost, as Nelson indicated, we have been working for some years to develop tools to support the disclosure, analysis, and dissemination of data on investments in infrastructure. And some of those tools include the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, which is quite a mouthful, but we summarize it as OC for IDS. Various disclosure platforms working with governments, a user-friendly way, a centralized point to access information on public investment. Recently, Cost Ukraine published a data analytics dashboard that includes real-time in public data on public investment that anyone can access. It's open to the public, and you can investigate data and then analyze the data. It's live, it's connected to the government's national procurement platform. These tools demonstrate how digital technologies are being used to improve transparency and fight corruption. And we should encourage governments and the private sector to consider them as an integral part of the infratech agenda. This is already happening, and to anyone who's interested in this, I would refer you to a recent publication from the G20 Riyadh Infratech agenda, which is linking these new technologies with anti-corruption. I'll pause there, Nelson. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think your 3 points of governance, transparency, and anti-corruption agenda is actually well made. Just before I open the floor to questions coming through, I've got a few questions that I want to put across to each of the panelists because I've been following your question. I think just to try and do that in the right order. Peter, you've just talked about the COSTI program, and you also referenced that FIDIC is in partnership, which I think is quite good. Can you tell us the genesis of the COSTI? Did it came from another industry as a good practice? and does it work very well in that industry? And how have you actually moved it forward, and who fund the project?
Thank you, Nelson. Good question. The acronym was the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative. We subsequently changed it to infrastructure because it chimes much more, it appeals to the kind of audience that we want to influence. It started as a pilot project by the UK Department for International Development, now the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, because it's changed its name. And you're right in the connection that you made with the extractives, Nelson. I suspect that many participants will be familiar with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative associated with Tony Blair and the UK government, and certainly having some success and a mature program in the extractive sector. At that time, the UK government took the view, can we look at the apparent success of the EITI and apply that to other sectors? Pharmaceuticals was one, and they had some progress on that, but not that much. They were looking at defense, and I think for some of the reasons you mentioned, Nelson, it became just too difficult to actually penetrate defense and the arms industry. And the other one was infrastructure. So DFID launched it as a pilot project from 2008 to 2011. At the end of that period, the World Bank stepped in with a small startup grant to help COST become an independent charity based here in London. And now, bringing it right up forward to 2020, we're working in 19 countries, a growing track record of success, and new tools and standards being published. Even, I think this afternoon, also marking International Anti-Corruption Day, COST will be launching an infrastructure transparency index that will measure the relative transparency within countries, between procuring entities, and hopefully in the future, looking at different countries and the relative levels of transparency between them. That's the potted history, Nelson.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, for that insight. I just want to come back to Juliana. You raised quite a fundamental point at the beginning of your presentation, and I think you talk about the ethics and the governance within a very large corporate entity. But one of the points you raised, which really struck me, was understanding that the pandemic really just need to mean that you have to revisit your policy and your governance, and more important, to make sure it's more applicable, especially now people are working from home and understanding different jurisdictions, they are going through the process at different times. With the footprint of the like of WSP, and bearing in mind that perhaps, Canada is a different area, United States is a different area, UK is a different area, and Africa is a different area, because I do know your operation there. The same thing with Middle East. How do you manage that process in such a way that each of your regional business units understand this time lag and know when to apply the change so that you don't miss a trick in this sort of time lag issue?
Yes, so good question. And I think one of the fundamental answers there is you integrate it as part of the business strategy. You have different strategies applicable to different regions. And I think someone mentioned, I believe it's Hamid, the compliance program is not the panacea to solution to anti-corruption. What is a key solution is the compliance program is integrated in the business strategy. The business strategy, especially for large international organizations, will be essentially decentralized to a certain degree to account for the regional realities, the regional differences in how governments will, during the recovery stage, I'm talking about the recovery stage, which is down the road, during the recovery stage, re-engage in infrastructure. It will also be linked to the timing of each region. So it's really important to have that ethical anti-corruption conversation as part of those regional recovery strategies, which will undoubtedly be different across the board. That's really how we would tackle it. And to do that, it really is important to make sure that that notion of business ethics is part of the leadership dialogue and not just a policy sitting in the background.
Okay, thank you very much, Jelena. I'm going to jump to James now. I think I once heard you, James, when you said, when you talk about corruption or issue, it has different view and different take in different parts of the geography. Obviously, you come from Africa, and a big recipient of donor agency work. And different governments are going through different issues. And it's not rocket science, let's be blunt about it, that is perceived that, in Africa, you have challenges, big challenges at government level. If we're talking about leadership and governance, and this particular leadership who are begging for grant to come into this area, do you see any shift coming through from that particular demand side of it rather than just the supply? Because it's easy to blame the supply side most of the time, but the demand side is where the gateway review come into process, where they can frustrate you from getting your payment, and they can tell you that you don't get on the list until you do X, Y, and Z. How is that? Is that changing, or is it business as usual?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nelson. And as you rightly say, and sadly, the demand side probably is the biggest catalyst of corruption in this part of the world, and I believe in many developing countries. The lack of governance structures, transparency, name it, kind of motivates the demand side of corruption. We have seen initiatives coming in, especially from multilateral banks, which are obviously concerned about the way the funds that they are lending to these countries are used and whether indeed they're effective in achieving the objectives for which they are borrowed. But we have a tough challenge when it comes to the political class and what corruption means to politics and leadership or political leadership. Political contests that are held in an atmosphere where the structures of integrity are lacking means that it's a situation where it is easier or almost survival for those in the political class to use money to achieve or acquire power. So unfortunately, not much has progressed, but we have seen countries putting in legal and regulatory framework. We have seen certain countries where the private sector has taken up this conversation with governments. We have seen more democratic space allowing people to be more vibrant in the fight against corruption and asking that this be embedded, holding people into account. But again, there is still so much to be done on the continent. And sadly, it has devastating consequences on the members of the public. I dare say three things here. That it appears that there is this unfortunate belief that public money doesn't belong to the public. Individuals don't seem to think that money or publicly borrowed money belongs to them. And that is a narrative that certainly needs to change, because we need the population to take a more active approach rather than a passive approach where they don't think it is their money. Secondly, the value system, as was mentioned here, I think it was by Peter, the value system obviously needs to be relooked at. And I say this because I find that unethical acquisition of wealth or wealth acquired through unethical practices is sadly celebrated. People don't ask how you made this money, but people will admire you and think that you are a kind of quasi-moral. So that's something that, again, governance structures need to be put in place and more forces to come in to change that thinking. Thirdly, consequences of corruption seem to be far less than the benefit of corruption. So we need to reverse that equation, and the population will play a big role to make sure that the consequences far outweigh the benefit of corruption. In other words, corruption has to be made extremely painful. So sadly, some progress made, but not enough of it, Dr. Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to come to Hamid now. I'm glad to know that Aiib adopted the debarment approach by all the existing MDB, and you're riding on the back of that. But you did say something in your presentation. I think you cleverly, very smartly, said, don't just point fingers at the developing country, but look across into UK, where pandemic is issue, and see contract being awarded to the friends of the government issue. And I think what James is saying is really in developing country, this is happening all the time. And now we're looking into the West, where it's supposed to be leaders, and what are we actually following? Are we following the right thing? Now, I'm asking the question, I've once seen a situation where we had a case, and actually I would probably say it was in India, where, you know, the recipient, you know, provincial had the fund from the, you know, MDB. I will not mention the MDB, and for the phase one of the work. The work was completed. There was an issue to do with dispute resolution there. There was an arbitration clause in it. Judgment was made in favor of the consultant. And then, you know, what happened was that they could not enforce that judgment because the payment has been consumed. The money has been consumed. And yet, you then get to a stage where there's a second stage of that project. And guess what? The MDB went to release the second tranche when the professional consulting firm was a victim of not getting paid from the first phase of that. The question is, at what point does the MDB take responsibility where between that phase of releasing funds, they are cognizant of the point that James said? It's not so much about that, is you do have role to play in that particular scenario. So what's your take as the New Kingdom bloc? How do we ensure that doesn't happen where phase one is definitely corrupt? And we know that, and phase two is coming through, and there's more money coming through. Is there a check and balances to make sure? I think you used the word, the assurance, post-award assurance. Is there a check and balance to your post-assurance award that enable you to track what happened in phase one so that that doesn't happen in phase two?
It's a pretty complex question, Nelson, but I hope I've understood it well, and let me try to respond.
Okay.
I think you've got to separate out corruption from contractual disputes.
Yeah.
Certainly where there is corruption, and that is established. And remember that, you know, in the MDB world, we are not criminal prosecutors.
Absolutely.
We're not looking for the criminal burden of proof. All you have to satisfy us is that on a balance of probabilities, it is more likely than not that corruption has taken place. Now that's much lower standard of proof, burden of proof than you would have in a criminal proceeding. So if that were the case, and you know, corruption could be established, then of course the MDB can stop disbursements. In fact, it would be almost required to stop disbursement on a corrupt project. Now we may, we may want, of course, want action to be taken against the parties involved. We would go to the national authorities concerned, ask them to take action, because, you know, we as MDBs don't have any jurisdiction over civil servants who may be involved in corruption. But all we can do is debar private parties, companies, individuals involved in a corrupt act. I think the issue you mentioned, I'm not sure whether it relates entirely to corruption, because if there was an arbitration and a firm had won the arbitral award, it got it in his favor, then it was a question of enforcing it. And that is a risk I think you have to weigh up every time you go to a country. And I'm sure, you know, good companies put in a premium for that. And if you're operating in a country where you will have to litigate, you know, in the local courts, or try to get an arbitration award enforced, and you don't find the legal frame adequate, that's a risk you have to weigh up before you go into a country. I don't think MDBs are in the business. You see, it's I wear three hats. You know, I get complaints from NGOs and, you know, affected people when you know, we don't do our when project proponents, borrowers do not apply our environmental and social standards properly. I also deal with corruption complaints, and I value, you know, my department evaluates projects. In two of them, the first two, there's always a confusion as to whose project it is. It is not the MDB's project. It's not a World Bank project, or Aiib project, or an ADB project. It is a project of the country. And I think, you cannot lose sight of that. And therefore, in the instance you mentioned, where the arbitral award could not be paid because the government didn't have the money, that's not an MDB problem as such. So I have to really be very clear that we have to talk differently about contractual disputes from integrity issues, which are taken very seriously and where disbursements would be stopped.
I take your point, Hamid. I was playing that, from the point of view that in the West, we are getting to the point where we can see where government intervention in the process of dealing with pandemic and awarding contract in a non-procedural way is open them up, but also the traditional approach is to assume the consultant is responsible for looking after this. And I would not mention a case that I once in a consulting firm who did exactly the point of what you said, I am not working in this country because of that situation. We are going to shut down all our operation in that country. And the challenge that we have is when we start talking about capacity building in this country, because we cannot rely on the MDB support for resolving that issue. But if any allegation were to be brought against any consulting firm, it's easy for the MDB to put them on the blacklist. So it has to be a balancing act. And I've seen a lot of people, a lot of our members in the industry will say, I'm not working in that country. I'm going to take all my staff away from that country, which is not good for the country's development. And I just cite that. There is a lot of question coming from the floor. I don't want to.
Can I just briefly respond to that, Nelson? I think you raised an excellent issue, and I'm fully aware of that. I mean, as head of procurement, I heard this from consulting firms. I mean, at that time when I was head of procurement, ADB was doing about $400 million of technical assistance, and all consulting firms were chasing that. We did a much larger amount in loans. But the quality engineering firms would frankly come and say, look, we're not going to bid on the loan side because our payment comes from the country and not from ADB. And, there's funny business going on. So my question to you is that clearly there are consulting firms which are taking on that loan business, if you like, where the payments are made not by the MDB concerned, but by the country or the agency. What is FIDIC doing to work with those types of companies and say, look, how are you managing this in those countries, and what sort of support can you provide to them? To what extent can those firms be enlisted in the fight against corruption? It's a difficult issue.
It is a difficult issue, but I'll put it to you that we have 102 countries around the world where we have member association, and FIDIC provide this guide for each of our association to follow what James talked about, the themes, and we encourage our members wherever they are, whether they're global, whether they're local, to follow those good practices on themes, and that's the best we can do. Because ultimately, those member associations whose member firm are their member are the one who are dealing with the government at that level. And the best we can do is to provide guide and advice. And really, we cannot police that particular intervention. But the truth of the matter is, Hamid, is that when you listen to what James said earlier on, and when you listen to other activities being said, in some of these developing countries, the government is the biggest buyer of the services, and therefore they rely on the government, and to some extent they're in a very monopolistic issue, whether it's a loan or grant, they've got to find a way. So the best we are doing, and I believe that we continue to do that under the leadership of James, is to make sure that we have good policy. We encourage our members to make sure that their companies who are firm members, such as WSP and others, that they have their own in-house ethical standard that they follow, and they follow that religiously. And if they find a client to be in the naughty part, basically say, we don't want to work for you. Frankly, we don't want to work for you. And there's nothing wrong about that. We stand by that. And, and ultimately, that's the only way we can change it. The more we can learn to say no, then it comes down to who is going to deliver the infrastructure. There is a lot of question coming through, and I just want to pick some of the question from the floor. Andy, thank you very much for the question you put across to me. And the first one that's coming through, I'm sure you can see them. are the MDBs doing enough to, to fight against corruption? I hear from Hamid that there is an understanding going on among the MDB to make sure they have a blacklisting and they're doing the best they can, and perhaps that's what they can do. There is another question that came through. The integrity management clause is like a weapon whose weakness depends on the user. I believe that it is well-intentioned and should be practiced, but we should take caution because it has also been said, the road to prediction is full of good intention. So you can come up with all this policy, it's how you put it into practice that really matters. I think Julian talked about that earlier on, that having it there at the beginning before pandemic is one thing, but making sure it's part of the regional business strategy is absolutely important. So you can come up with a big agenda at the corporate level, then individual region need to customize that to make sure they can deliver that, which is quite interesting. Another question or maybe comment, corruption is an open wound, especially in the developing countries such as Balkans. FIDIC is a very good tool that we use in international infrastructure projects. If FIDIC develops means for identification and penalty for corruption, it will be even a stronger tool to manage funds properly. I suspect that we are not in a position to actually stipulate that. I think this is the jurisdiction of the government and those who are lending. What we can do as an organization is to make sure that we put good practices in place. We encourage our members to follow those practices. And if they do have a situation where they discover there are different channels of reporting, and I think there's whistleblowing, there's all sorts of opportunities. So I will refer that back to your home country. Next question is to do, our company has very stringent corporate governance policies. I learned that the hard way through that, even though the best policy gets circumcised in every subtle manner by hypocrites, no matter how attractive the compensation package is, it is simply inherent to human nature not to be contented with what we have. Now, I think the word there is great. And I hear the point that was being said, it is great. I think, Peter said that earlier on, is that, if you do not pay people with the right salary and the environment is conducive for that, and I think James also talked about the consequence of it. If you don't deal with this issue and people, get involved with corruption, but the penalty is not stiff enough, people will go on and do it. So the point I hear is whatever you are being paid as a professional, which is what we advocate in our industry, there is nothing out there that should distract you from your professionalism and for what you are being rewarded for. Anil, this is a very long one. I'm not sure whether I can put it across, but I'll try and read it out as best as I can. Whilst most organizations in our industry have governance processes designed to combat fraud and corruption, the perception among most engineers is that the responsibility for that function lies with accountants, auditors, and the risk team within the organization, or who's still whistleblower. I suggest that it is far too late, and every employee should be told that everyone can and should be a fraud detective. That's an interesting one.
Dr. Nelson, if I may comment on that one as well after you.
Yes, please. Everyone should be considered as a fraud detective. So in the same way, we monitor health and safety, sustainability and quality in our project control plan. Please, can we add fraud and corruption monitoring as the norm from Anil? So Flo, it's a big question. Can we turn everybody in our organization to become detective? So Juliana, do you want to start that off, please?
I don't think you need to turn everybody in your organization to be a detective in order to make sure that there's a culture shift. And I think that's exactly right. If there's a perception that the accountability for anti-corruption controls resides in audit and risk, there still is work to be done in terms of the culture of the organization. If leaders come in and have a focus on revenue without having a parallel focus on doing business the right way, there's a message that's going to be lost. So I think if there's a leadership shift in terms of culture and in terms of doing the right thing, being part of the top line agenda, you don't need to turn everybody into a detective. Your culture is naturally going to go in that way. That being said, there should always be a whistleblowing hotline available for anybody to report a concern. I mean, that's a key control that's quite frankly, essential in our industry.
Well, thank you very much. Juliana, there's another question which is more specific to WSP, and I'm sure you've seen it. You walk around the world, you partner with different people around the world, small firm, big firm, supply chain, collaborative project, different procurement processes. How do you vet all your partners? How do you vet them?
And I think, and Dr. Nelson, I think the exchange you and Hamid had was extraordinary. I really enjoyed the back and forth. I think for business partners, you're exactly right. Third-party risk is a very big risk in terms of corruption within our industry. I think, you know, it's always a risk-based approach. The likelihood of corruption depends on location. It depends on the project. It depends on the business partner type. So you need to make sure your business is plugged into the corruption risks involved in each project and in each third party that you do business with, and then require that the third party go through the adequate level of vetting for that type of project, which won't be the same from one country to another.
Okay, thank you very much, Elena. Less on you, and I'm going to go to Hamid. There's a question to you, and it said, would Aiib take a fresh approach to multilateral funding by using procurement framework and contract models, by taking more hands-on and collaborative approach using alliances and rather than traditional adversarial? Is that something, Hamid, that you would consider? I know you've just signed up to adopting all FIDIC contract document, which is very good, but would you consider, collaboration and alliancing contracts?
Let me look. I don't have the procurement function, and frankly, I've not spoken to the procurement head on this. But one general point I will make is that we are a new, multilateral financial institution, and while we are in the gene pool of the MDBs, we do want to be different. So where we think that being different can add value and can help us to do better projects, can help us to be more responsive to our clients, we will certainly consider different approaches, and we have done that in quite a few areas. So I would strongly encourage that this is taken up by our procurement people. I just want to make a couple of comments on the earlier discussion, Nelson, if you allow me.
Yes, please.
I think on the issue of culture, what Juliana said was absolutely crucial. That you've got to have. Not everyone has to be a fraud investigator, but everyone has to be aware of their responsibility, and the culture has to promote reporting of corrupt act. In the case of Aiib, failure to report a corrupt act or a prohibited practice, as we say, is actually misconduct. So if you as an employee of Aiib are witness to an act of corruption, you can be proceeded against for misconduct, which could lead to dismissal if you do not report it. We also have an email address, integrity@aib.org. You can make an anonymous complaint about any of our projects or any of our officers who may be involved in corruption. I think that's very, very powerful. Another comment I have is, and coming back to our earlier discussion, I think it's very difficult to put individual firms in that invidious situation where you expect them to carry the burden of fighting a particular agency, which is perhaps awarding most of the contracts in that country. But I think what FIDIC may consider, and this I'm just throwing this out for your consideration. Why don't you do a perception survey of your firms per country and publish it? That I think would generate pressure. So if country X, none of the big firms ever want to work in it, that sends a very powerful message.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm told that we've got roughly about 5 minutes to go, and I'm going to do my usual stuff. Time now to chill out and relax. So I'm going to start off with James and just ask you with what would be your one sentence advice to the industry, and then I'll go on to Matthew and I'll do Juliana and finish with Hamid before I bring Bill into the conversation. So James, you kick us a good start. What would be your keyword advice to the industry? United Nations Against Corruption today. So what's your key message to the industry?
I think we must lobby so that procurement processes and anti-corruption processes reward those who are ethical. It's the high time that those who do the right thing get rewarded. So we need to embed that when selecting service providers, suppliers. We also need to make sure that people must feel that being ethical pays. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go across to Matthew now.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Nelson. It's not really advice, but I would just like to say on International Anti-Corruption Day, let's spare a moment and think of all those working in the private sector throughout the world, individuals who often at great risk to themselves take on this challenge of tackling corruption. There's no glory in it. Often it's a great risk, but they do it because it's the right thing to do. And I think it's appropriate that we pay a tribute to them today. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very profound statement. Juliana, your advice, comments on this Anti-Corruption Day?
Yes, talk about it. Not only on Anti-Corruption Day, but on all other days during the year. Talk about the different issues you face within your business. Make sure that it's a culture that's engaged in dialogue on corruption, so that that dialogue freely flows within your organization and you promote a speak up culture, which again is key to fighting corruption.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Hamid, your word of encouragement on today?
I think build coalitions. None of us can do it alone. And in particular, I think building coalitions with people who are opinion makers, with different parts, with CSOs, with academia, with even politicians. There are good politicians who are honest, and we need to identify them, build coalitions with them, journalists and so on, because it will take all of us working together to tackle this very, very difficult issue.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I really appreciate it. Bill, not a lot to cover. The floor is yours. You go 1 minute or 2 minutes to give us your closing statement, and I'll wrap up. Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nelson, and thank you, panelists, for a terrific discussion. You hit so many very critical points, and it'd be impossible for me to highlight them. But one thought that I'd like to share with the group is advice to all firms that practice in civil environmental engineering, that if you are going to operate in a country with a high reputation for corruption, don't think really that there is much probability that you can do so, even if you are totally clean and honest, and that you will get probably caught up in a problem. And it may not be a direct corruption problem from your end. It may well be that you become the victim of a claim or a lack of payment or frustration over execution, all of those problems. So it's a compelling case for most healthy firms to stay away from areas that they know have a high probability of corruption. I also like the idea that I think Peter mentioned, maybe it was Hamid, I apologize, but the concept of a confidential survey of our member associations and firms about areas where they're very reluctant to work directly for a country because of the corruption issue. And many firms, I'll close it as one thing, many firms, as we all know, have sort of a policy of following projects funded and controlled by multi-development banks and countries without a corruption risk, and stay away from everywhere else. There's a lot of firms that operate that way very successfully. More than 1 minute as usual, Nelson, but that's the best I could do.
Thank you very much, Bill. We're now going to go through the next and the final sort of poll. Barbara is going to put it up for us. I think it's very simple. We've had opportunity to discuss, to hear from the bank, from the private sector, from FIDIC, and also for initiative. Now, at this point, we're going to put a question across, which is self-explanatory. Have our speakers today effectively addressed the issue of corruption, and how can we eradicate it within our industry? Do we think we've actually addressed it as best as possible? You know, yes or no, or don't know. Time for you to vote. I think you go roughly about 10 seconds to submit your vote, and then we get the feedback, and I'll try and summarize. It's been an interesting conversation so far. And I think, you know, the feedback that we're getting from the industry so far, we speak about 182 people online. I understand that we've had nearly 250 in and out, which is not bad from so many countries. So it'd be interesting to get the result of that poll. Barbara, are we ready for that? I think the result is coming through. Yes, yes, that is pleasing. Well, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all the panelists, to say we've spent a lot of time to cover this, and I think the feedback actually confirmed that you've done the best we can to try and address this. Well, what I know for sure is that FIDIC represents 102 countries around the world where there's member association all over the world. Doesn't matter which part of it, we cover the globe. And the three, you know, pillar that Bill talked about, which is one about quality of what we do, sustainability of our industry and what we design, and the integrity are the three pillars for our industry. On this day of UN Anti-Corruption Day, it is a great initiative, but we also need to take ever vigilant and work tirelessly that all year round, as been said by the speaker, that we have this at the top of our mind. I hear the word that yes, survey within countries should be done to see which country that members don't want to work on. But the big message that I understand here is one about culture. If the culture is right in the organization with the right leadership and direction, and having your strategy link up to your business strategy, your ethical strategy link with your business strategy, it doesn't matter how big or small you are, and it doesn't matter which sector you work on. What is important is you constantly have it, regularly review it, look at the circumstances that prevail, and make sure you adapt it to that particular change. And with the issue of pandemic, we now have a challenge where the world wants to deal with the health crisis. And in the health crisis means we need to invest money very quickly. And that means sometimes we want to cut corner because we want to invest, we want to kickstart the economy, or we want to prepare people and society in such a way that they can actually live and healthy until this vaccination comes through. Now, the challenge we have is very simple. How do we overcome the urgency to deliver very quickly without compromising the need for us to have check and balance? So the challenge for us, for our industry, is not just on the consulting side, or it's not just contracting over the client, is that we have total responsibility. We should talk about it every day. We should live it and breathe it. And we should ask the question, and we should be bold enough to say a country is not fit, we do not want to work in that country. And we should be prepared to name and shame people. And I hear one word from James who said, you know, the value that we put across to the system that we need to adopt is very critical. And more important, the consequence of not doing anything is damaging to the society. And we need to look at that consequence. Now, I know for sure that for every $1 you spend on investment, it has a multiple of 2.8 multiplier. And if it's a case that the $1 becomes 50 cents, then the chances of that multiple get reduced by 50%. We have an opportunity as an industry to be a player on today and every day of the year to make sure we do the right thing. And on this note, I want to thank our president, who, as usual, jumped up very early in the morning to join us for this particular session. I want to thank our other speakers, Juliana from WSP in Canada. I also want to thank Hamid from Beijing and James Mwangi from Kenya, and also my good friend Matthew from UK. The world is going on. Construction industry will continue to be in place, and we have a responsibility. FIDIC has got a number of tools for the industry to use. Please, if you are interested, don't hesitate to approach us. And for those who participated, thank you very much for wherever you are. And those of my team who are behind the scene to make sure everything go very well, thank you very much, Barbara, Andy, and everybody behind the scene. I believe there will be a summary of this particular session, which will be available within the next 2 hours on our website. So on that note, in my usual way, thank you for joining us. There will be more activity coming up in the new year, a new series of FIDIC webinar post-COVID that's going to come through. And we'd like to invite you to join us. And I want to use this opportunity to say thank you. Wherever you are, be safe and Merry Christmas in advance. Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you.